Hi everyone, my name is Tim Edwards. Welcome to Bristol Talks Economics. We are delighted to be speaking with Stephanie Kelton, best-selling economist, professor at Stony Brook University, and former chief economist on the US Senate Budget Committee. Stephanie is the best-selling author of The Deficit Myth, a book that aims to re-articulate common misbeliefs and basically a new theory on fiscal spending. And we're really excited to be talking through the theory today. So, Stephanie, what is modern monetary theory and what are its core tenets?
Okay, well, thank you. It's nice to get to spend a little bit of time with you. I don't know how many of you there are. Do you, Tim, know?
Yeah, so we've got 64 on the call so far, and more will continue to join.
How many did you say? 6?
No, 64.
64. Yeah, I'm scrolling and I see lots of names here. Look, I will give you the core tenets, but I want to start by saying, whenever I'm asked to explain MMT, just often they'll do this to me in an interview. Just quickly explain MMT. So, I don't want to give short shrift to the work of a number of scholars who now for a quarter of a century have been, building out the literature, the scholarly literature that if we were going to wrap our arms around it all, we could call it the body of work that is MMT. So it's a lot. And there are a lot of, people who started many, many years ago. I came in on the project at the kind of early stage in the mid 1990s. An Australian economist named Bill Mitchell and Randy Ray and Warren Mosler and Matt Forstater, Pavlina Chernova. There were sort of, a half dozen or so of us in that kind of early period that started working together around a set of core questions. Okay, so now we get to, well, how do we get to the elevator pitch? What is it? We were interested in trying to lay out a more accurate description of the mechanics of government finance under different monetary regimes. So that's sort of the starting point. And, in the mid 90s, that's when there was so much debate. And I was living in the UK at the time. I was going to school at Cambridge, and there was a lot of pressure at the time on the UK to adopt the euro and to be among the first, set of countries that gave up a sovereign currency and joined the Economic and Monetary Union. I remember those debates very well. And I just have the good fortune of ending up surrounded by some people, including Warren Mosler, but also Charles Goodhart and some others who, when godly, most importantly, probably when godly, who thought about this question in a different way, about the importance of retaining monetary sovereignty and why that has important implications for a government's capacity to spend, right? Your fiscal capacity and your ability to manage your, interest rate and so forth. So at the core, MMT is about understanding the nature of the monetary system that exists in any particular part of the world. And once you identify the nature of the monetary system, what are the capacities, right? What is the policy space available to governments under different kinds of monetary regimes?
That's a really good overview. So I think going back into the more sort of like historical components of the theory, I believe one of the things modern monetary theory disputes is the idea that money was created to serve as a store of value, a unit of accounts, and a means of exchange. Instead, it favors the idea of chattelism, as in currency was what rulers accepted to be paid in. Like the only way tax could only be paid by currency, and therefore that created the innate intrinsic demand for the currency. So basically, how does modern monetary theory believe like the origins of money were?
Oh my God, Tim!
Sorry about that.
Jesus. No, we have a whole hour just on this question. And, it's not even currency, I mean, that word we would have to define, right? Because let me say this, in Randy Wray's book, his second book was called Understanding Modern Money. And he was writing that. He was starting to work on that project just before I started Cambridge. So in 1995 and the first part of 96, I was at the University of Denver, where Randy had been a professor. And he had just made these connections with Warren Mosler, and he was starting to think about this. And there's a chapter in his book on the history of money, where Randy goes into the, where economists rarely go into, right? The work of anthropologists and sociologists and historians and numismatists and people who actually take seriously the question of, money. I mean, Keynes did to some extent, right? And very unusual for an economist now to take such an interest in questions like that. So Randy and I then started reading, A. Mitchell Innes and the work of Jeff Ingham there in the UK, who writes about money as from the perspective of a sociologist, right? Reading philosophers, David Graeber, what is this story that economists like to tell? The economist's lazy textbook story that I learned when I was a student of economics. You turn to the page where money is first mentioned, if it's mentioned at all, in a principles kind of textbook. It usually says, that once upon a time, we all just walked around bumping into each other, trying to trade goods for goods, right? In a barter economy, that Robinson and Crusoe, Robinson caught the fish and Crusoe got the coconuts or whatever, and they engage in trade. And over time, somehow spontaneously, money gets invented. And primitive forms of money, shells, beads, wampum, all this sort of stuff. And then you get this evolutionary story where eventually, people hit on precious metals because they have these nice properties. They're durable, they're portable, they're divisible. And so precious metals step in, but it's somebody will come and steal your gold. So then you put your gold with, in a safe place. And then, the bank finds out, I can, lend against the gold, and I can issue paper currency that's gold backed and convertible, and people will take that. So that's the story that Charles Goodhart calls the metalist story, right? That somehow we find the origin, the nature of money we trace back to, a desire to reduce transaction costs, inefficiencies associated with barter, and precious metals are sort of the early money things. And then, you have difficulty explaining a fiat currency system where, the currency is no longer convertible. And then against that, you have this, what you call chartalist school, the work of guys like, George Friedrich Knapp, the German, philosopher, not an economist, right? Who wrote the State Theory of Money, and others who said, no, money evolves very differently. It doesn't spring forth spontaneously to solve the double coincidence of wants and the inefficiency of barter. Money comes into existence along with private property and record keeping. Writing, the first records that we have, written records, are to keep track of obligations, right? Debts to one another. And so you can actually have a well-functioning credit system without a physical thing at all. You don't need what we think of today as currency. You just need, tallies. And in the UK, you had tally sticks, right? And Randy writes about this in his book. But you literally can just have a piece of paper, where you record the entries, the debits and credits, in some unit that is chosen, right? You have the pound, we have the dollar. These are abstract units used for record keeping purposes. But the way to find, the origin of money is to look to the role of the state, to the introduction of private property, the ability of the state to begin to make and enforce, and the legal system, right? Obligations, fees, fines, payments, taxes are just one form.
Why do you think that the metalist view of the purpose of money is the conventional one taught in economics textbooks, especially at undergrad? And why didn't Knapp's view, why isn't the Knapp's view of the obligation approach the more mainstream equivalent?
It's a good question. Because economists are lazy. I mean, you know, I'm married to a historian, and I'm an economist, so I could sort of say that economists do not, I think, now I'm generalizing, right? But I'm saying this as someone who's been attending professional academic conferences for many years, and many of them, in the heterodox community, where they do a much better job of reading outside their field. But many mainstream economists, I think, only read other mainstream economists. They don't take the interest in the work of psychologists. They view economics as a different kind of science, right? And that there's not much that can be learned from the work of people in anthropology departments and sociology departments and, history departments. And so I don't know, there's just a reluctance, I think, to complicate matters, because when you get into all this stuff, this is a more complicated story. Economists like simple models, parsimonious, little neat and tidy stories that these sort of complicating details with all this rich history. And I don't know why we aren't braver.
I mean, my next question would be then, what does modern monetary theory need to do before, like, what condition needs to be met before MMT becomes integrated into conventional economic thinking? Like, sort of, would it need to pass like almost empirical test if as is going on in America, and a lot of policy leaders are discussing implementing a lot of things like the Green New Deal policies that have their roots in MMT, or at least supported by it? Or is there a theoretical consideration that needs to be met before MMT occurs in the principles of macroeconomics textbook?
I don't know. I don't know. There are, of course, textbooks written by MMT economists. I'm reminded, your question reminds me of something that David Colander said. And if your people listening in can Google this and find this story. I think Randy Ray has told this story a number of times, but I think David Colander has also told the story. Now, Colander is a professor of economics, and he was a student of Abel Lerner's and a collaborator of Abel Lerner's. And David teaches at Barnard, I want to say at Barnard College, which is part of Columbia University. I think Barnard and Columbia, there's an affiliation. Anyway, David writes textbooks. He writes economics principles level textbooks. And David tries to push the envelope to get in richer, more kind of nuanced ways of thinking about a lot of things that stray from the conventional, right, principles approach. And he has said, and this is the point I'm trying to make, that you cannot depart by more than 10%. That's what the publishers will allow. If you do more, 90% of it needs to look like every other like principles text. Then you have 10% to play with. And if you try to bring in more than 10% that departs too much from the conventional mainstream, they just won't, they'll push back. They won't allow it, right? So I think that's part of the answer to the question. How does that begin to change over time?
I think recently in Bristol, at least, we've been using quite a new textbook called Core at undergrad, which intends to introduce some more heterodox topics into the syllabus. So I think sort of dismantling, or at least challenging the orthodox views is essential for, I think, also alleviating some
the other
criticisms.
thing is we can always reject textbooks. I don't particularly like them. And, for many years at the University of Missouri in Kansas City, one of my colleagues was Fred Lee, who taught, I think, at the University of Manchester for many years. anyway, Fred wouldn't teach from textbooks. I remember one time at a seminar, he carried us, he had a stack of mainstream, the go-to textbooks. He was a micro theorist. And in this seminar, he went over to the window, opened the window, and hurled. And we weren't on the ground floor. I mean, there could have been, but he just threw them all out the window. And it was his way of saying, I can teach. I'm going to teach what I want my students to know, and I'll introduce them to things that I think are important. And they may come from inside economics. They may come from outside, but that's more or less the way I have always tried to, put my courses together as well.
Interesting. So I think going back to the roots of the theory, from what I understand, the main constraint of government spending is inflation. Now, you previously said, I believe on an interview on MSNBC or CNN, something about the US has not experienced demand pull inflation for the past 100 years. Can you expand on how MMT could be integrated into the economy on a policy level?
Okay. Well, MMT is integrated into the economy on a policy level in the sense that it's a description of the mechanics of the federal budgeting process and the monetary system. So we're doing it now, right? MMT is here. It is present because we're describing how it all works. So, after coronavirus, right, this really hit the US hard beginning in March. And Congress quickly responded with 4 pieces of legislation, like passing bills, normally we don't behave like that, but all of a sudden we had all these spending bills coming out. One of them was called the CARES Act, and it was a $2.2 trillion spending bill where Congress just got together. The House wrote a bill, passed it out of the House. It went to the Senate. The Senate said, okay, passed it out of the Senate. And we had $2.2 trillion authorized to spend into the economy. So, where did that money come from? It came from Congress voting to appropriate. The word we use is it's an appropriation. It means that Congress can commit to spending money it does not have. They didn't go out and get $2.2 trillion from anywhere. They didn't go to China. They didn't go, raise our taxes. They just said, guess what? We are passing a bill that commits us to spending $2.2 trillion. Where's the money come from? Well, the government's fiscal agent is the Federal Reserve. And when Congress passed that bill, it was effectively ordering up from the Fed $2.2 trillion. The Congress said, get ready, because you're going to go make these payments on our behalf. And the Fed doesn't say no to Congress. It doesn't bounce checks that are authorized by Congress. Its job is, in part, to carry out payments on behalf of Treasury as authorized by Congress, which is what it did. So are there limits? Okay, this is your question is getting at this question, at this important question of the limits. So after the CARES Act passed, the House went and wrote another bill. This time they wrote a $3 trillion bill and they called it the HEROES Act. And they said, we're not done yet. We want to spend $3 trillion more. Okay. We don't have $3 trillion. What we have is the power of the purse. We are Congress. We can commit to spending money we don't have. We want to spend $3 trillion more. The Senate said, not so fast. Okay, we have this guy, Mitch McConnell, who is the Republican who leads the Senate. And he said, I don't want to go along with this additional $3 trillion because it gives money to state and local governments. And we want to punish governors in blue states and all this nonsense. So the Senate said no to that spending. The point I'm trying to make is, suppose the Senate had said yes to that spending. Then instead of the last 7 months being gridlock, we would have had an additional commitment and more fiscal support for the economy as $3 trillion got released from Congress into the pocketbooks of the working people of this country and struggling small businesses and so forth. Now, would that have been too much spending? Obviously, it would have increased the deficit significantly. That would have increased the national debt. That would make a lot of people anxious. But what MMT is about is saying, don't get anxious about the number that falls out of the budget box at the end of every year. It's not what's important. Don't get, heart palpitations because this thing we call the national debt is increasing. That's not what is important. What is important is the health, the security of the people in our economy, right? The viability of businesses in our economy, the safety and security of the people and the families, and holding things intact and jobs and so forth. So if that additional $3 trillion in the HEROES Act could have made its way into the economy so that people would have the income to pay their mortgage, their rent, their car payment, their student loan payment, buy groceries and food. We got cars lined up at food banks here. We got people losing health care, right? If all of that could have been done, the income support could have been provided without inflationary pressures accelerating, then what is the problem? Then what is the problem? That's what we mean when we say the relevant constraint on government is not a financial one. There's no hard financial constraint. Congress could write a $20 trillion spending bill if they want. They literally could pass a $20 trillion spending bill. Now, I suspect that would be too much. Okay, so then the question becomes, how do you budget? How do you guard against, excessive spending? And what should the budgeting process look like so that Congress is taking advantage of fiscal space when it's available, prioritizing, because you can't have everything. Budgets are about, they're a moral document, but they're also about prioritizing, right? So that's so much of what MMT is about, is, shifting the things that we focus on and the relevant constraints.
Yeah, so could you expand on the issue of national debts not being as cataclysmic as some commentators make it out to be?
Yes, I thought I had my props. I'm looking through it. I have them. Sometimes I keep them right here. So, okay, what is this thing we call the national debt? It's a terrible, adjective. It really is, because as soon as you start talking about debt, immediately we associate debt with something that, it's onerous, it's a burden, it has to be repaid. We all know from personal experience that it's possible to take on debt that you have difficulty paying back, right? You can get into trouble. So then we hear the government is piling on debt and all this sort of stuff, and they start telling us to think of it as our debt, right? That somehow all of the debt that the government is taking on actually belongs to us, that it's our liability, that we're on the hook, that we're going to have to pay this thing back. Completely wrong. So in the book, I say, all right, take a deep breath, right? And don't let the words get in the way. Don't let the word deficit, which also has a negative connotation, get in the way. Don't let the word debt intrude, right? Get in the way. So think of it this way. The thing we call the deficit is just the difference between two numbers. That's all it is. One of the numbers is, I'll do this in pounds. One of the numbers is how many pounds the British government is spending into the economy each year. And the other number is how many they are subtracting out of the economy, mostly through taxation. Okay. So the deficit is the difference between two numbers. Deficit means government adds more than it subtracts. Okay, is that a bad thing? We say the government adds 100 and subtracts 90. We label it a government deficit. And on some ledger somewhere, we write a -10 and we put government name on it. But what we forget is if they add 100 and only subtract 90, somebody gets 10. That their deficit is literally showing up in some other part of the economy as a financial contribution, as a surplus. So there are 10 pounds sitting out there in somebody's hands that are only there because of the government deficit. So now what happens? A government deficit adds to the penny or the pence to the non-government's financial surplus. So somebody is sitting out there with 10 pounds they wouldn't have had. Now the government comes along and says, uh-oh, I ran a deficit. So whenever I run a deficit, I match up my deficit spending by selling gilts, right? So I sell government bonds. And so I take that 10 pounds away from you and I replace it with a government bond of equal value. The difference is the government bond pays interest. So this is an interest-bearing form of government money. I mean, it's a government currency, right? The British government is the sole legal authority that can issue both instruments. The British pound can only come from the British government, right? And its fiscal agent, Bank of England. So I'm putting them together. You are the issuer of the pound and you are the issuer of the gilt. Nobody else on earth can issue those instruments. They can only come from you. And so if you think about it, the debt, the thing we call the debt, is just the dollars that were spent by government, not taxed back, that got transformed into a gilt. So the debt is the pounds spent by government, not taxed away, currently being saved. They're your savings in the form of this safe financial instrument called a government bond. That's all it is. Right? So government can choose to make payments in one of two forms. They can pay you in non-interest bearing currency. They can pay you in interest bearing currency. Bonds are a form of payment. Right? It's just a different form of payment.
Why, again, I think this goes back to sort of integrating MMC into the wider debate. Why is it that people immediately jump to the sort of, what would it take so people consider government debt as a different thing entirely to personal debt? What do you think could be done to break that mental connection?
So I think, here we have the Congressional Budget Office, and there you have the IFC, what's it called? ORB?
Yeah, Office of Budget Responsibility.
OBR, Office of Budget Responsibility, or something akin sort of to a CBO. So the CBO is actually a government entity, right? A creature of Congress. I don't think that's the same for you, but the CBO puts out annually a budget outlook, a short-term budget outlook, a long-term budget outlook, and so they are presenting the fiscal picture, painting a picture, right, for journalists, for policymakers, for the average person. Everybody can see this thing. And they say, this is the debt to GDP ratio, and this is the amount of debt that we project the government will have over the next 75 years and so forth. So how do you change the discourse? Well, you just call it something else, right? Why do we use the word debt? Why don't we say this is the US dollar savings, outstanding, projected, or this part of the US money supply is projected to look like this. The deficit, you could just as easily, instead of using the word deficit, say, this is the non-government surplus as we project it into, the next 10 years or whatever. Just, a number 6, right? If you have the number 6 and you flip it upside down, it becomes a 9, right? It's the same shape. It's just looked at from two different perspectives and we give it a different name. The deficit is the same thing. A fiscal deficit, if you turn it around, is a financial surplus, right, on some other balance sheet. So we are choosing to use words like fiscal deficit, national debt, when we could easily choose different words to describe the same thing and give it, I think, more meaning, right? More meaning, but lower the temperature in the room by helping people get a better understanding of what this actually is, right?
Yeah, very interesting.
Call it wealth, yeah. US dollar wealth held in the form of government bonds. Call it that.
If we talk now a bit about your experience directly in policy, in like the beating heart of American politics with Senator Bernie Sanders, the Democratic Party, and your experience as the local monetarist owl on Capitol Hill, how would you say? What was the policymakers' response to some of your ideas, and where do you see policy going within the state?
Well, look, I keep certain things confidential. I
completely understand.
I write a little bit. I'll tell you some things. I write a little bit in the book, And I do name some names in the book, as I tell stories about how some of these conversations went over the years. But I can tell you without giving you too much, because I am always asked to, keep things confidential. So much has changed in the last year. So much has changed on Capitol Hill. Some of it started to change after the tax cuts, after Trump's tax cuts in 2017, when I think, many Democrats and many economists who have advised previous Democratic administrations said, look, if the Republicans pass these huge tax cuts and blow up the deficit, then the Congress is not going to have the money to respond if the economy turns down. Another recession will come, and when that happens, we will not have the fiscal capacity to support the economy because we will have already added too much to the deficit, too much to the debt. Now, fast forward, right? The Republicans did their huge tax cuts. They added a couple of trillion to deficits. The economy turns down, coronavirus comes, and what do? We start committing trillions of dollars with no problem whatsoever. And so the point is that Democrats are starting to figure out that deficits are not the dangerous, gorilla that they've been told, right? That they don't obviously drive up interest rates, crowd out private investment, lead to slow, that so much of what we've heard over the years, it's just not right. And they don't like the fact that Republicans, whenever they have a chance, they run policy to carry out their agenda. And they don't care if it adds to the deficit. They don't care if it increases the debt, but they get their policy agenda through. They wanted those tax cuts. By God, they got them. And Democrats, conversely, think that they hold themselves to a different and higher set of standards, that they pay for their priorities. They're reluctant to, do things that would increase the deficit, to accomplish parts of their agenda. They no longer think like that. And I can tell you, because I am engaged often in discussions with Senate, House members. I am working closely with many, many members of Congress, and they are fed up and they feel like they have been playing Charlie Brown to Lucy in the football for, decades now, and they're done with it. They're tired of it, and their thinking is shifting on, what it means to be fiscally responsible. They really are developing a different understanding of the mechanics of government finance, of the relevant limits, and so forth. So I'm regularly in conversations that include things like, okay, so now how do we begin to change the narrative? Because we've sort of backed ourselves into a corner talking about the Clinton surpluses and what a great thing we did balancing the budget. And we're the really responsible party when it comes to fiscal. And they don't want to have to bear the weight of that going forward, because they recognize that, the only way to try to get back to that place is through, cuts to spending and austerity. And they don't want to do that.
I mean, we saw austerity in the UK was not great for the economy. I think some people estimate it extended the recession by about 3 years. So, yes. If we quickly turn over to audience Q&A, I think we've got some really good questions coming through in the chat, starting with Manu. What do you think is the best way to implement the job guarantee that forms part of MMT? For example, could it be used to mobilize the unemployed people towards decarbonizing the economy?
Yes, that is a big part of the plan. So I mentioned earlier the core group of economists that started in the early years with, building out the literature that became MMT. Pavlina Cherneva has a book that came out, I think, about a week after my book. And it's a little book, but it's called The Case for a Federal Job Guarantee. And in that book, if the person who asked the question is interested, she will all walk through a variety of the kinds of jobs. So what we broadly envision is that people who are hired into public service employment or the federal job guarantee program are doing work that broadly contributes to building a care economy, caring for people, caring for the planet, caring for our communities. And caring for the planet is the kind of work that was just described. And yes, that is and has always been kind of integral way before Green New Deal and climate, really blew up and became a sort of policy priority. That's always been for us a key part of the job guarantee. I talk about it in the book as well.
I've read that chapter book. It's very interesting. Yeah. I think the next question comes from Ekaterina saying, is there a threshold of financial market development and trust in the government that allows you to say that the financial constraint is not binding for the government? Surely for emerging market economies, it is still very much binding.
Yeah, so this is where I started the conversation when I said that MMT is about looking at the specific country. Who are we talking about? What is the nature of the monetary system in place? What is the nature of the ruling regime, right? Do you have an authoritarian or autocrat? Is there corruption widespread? Do you have a sound democracy? Do you have governments that have borrowed heavily in foreign currency? Lots of foreign denominated debts. There are all these questions. So when we talk about, a government having fiscal space, right? What can governments do with their policy? Think of a spectrum. And in the book, I say, think of a spectrum of monetary sovereignty. Some countries have a lot, and by virtue of having a lot, have the flexibility to orient their macroeconomic policies around an agenda, like to define their policy agenda and then commit to spending. You can only buy what is available and for sale in your unique currency. Okay, that is the upper limit to what you can have as government. When the pandemic was raging, even though the US dollar is the global reserve currency and Congress could commit all the money in the world to fighting it, we could not have ventilators and PPE because they weren't available for sale in the current, couldn't get them, right? So you have to have goods and services, labor available and priced in the currency that you control. In emerging markets, and I have a chapter in the book that gets, very deeply into this, there are often constraints in terms of monetary sovereignty is not enough. You could be a monetary sovereign, but if you don't have food sovereignty, if you aren't energy sovereign, if you are dependent on other countries for essential things like food, energy, technologies, medicine, then you have to be able to import those things to meet domestic needs, right? Because you don't have the productive capacity to produce them yourself. Now, in order to get them, you got to be able to purchase them on foreign exchange markets. You got to be able to get those things. And if people don't want to sell to you in exchange for your currency, then you need the dollar or a euro or a yen, right? You need another currency. And so there are real limits in terms of how aggressively you can run your macro policy without having to worry about what if my exchange rate depreciates. In the US, the dollar could fall by 30%, and we're still going to be able to, purchase everything we need as a country. We're not going to be locked out of energy or medicine or, food. That's not true for many developing economies. So the constraints are different.
I think another very interesting question is from Alex saying, how do governments plan to combat inflation from MMT other than with taxes? Would we expect more targeted taxes and stimulus to become the norm to the point where governments start to play a much bigger role in the wider economy?
All right. So first thing is that MMT is not and has never been about using taxes to fight inflation after it happens. Okay. When I described some of my time on the budget committee, working for the Democrats as the chief economist, I don't think I ever once saw a member of the Senate introduce a bill that did not have a pay for, ever. In other words, the game that is played in Congress is, if I want to spend, 5 billion or 100 billion or 70 billion, whatever, if I want to write a bill to do some debt cancellation or some free college or some healthcare or something, I'm expected to pay for it. So I show you where the money's coming from. So what I do is I write my bill, I say how much I want to spend, and then I show you where the revenue is going to come from. So I make a proposal to raise this existing tax rate from here to here, or to introduce a new tax, like a financial transactions tax or a wealth tax or something. And I say, I can get revenue from here, and all of the money that I'm proposing to spend will be offset by all this new revenue. Okay. So what I'm saying is a couple of things. We use taxes today to try to avoid adding to the deficit, so that every new dollar of spending is fully offset by a dollar of new revenue in order to avoid adding to the deficit. Here's the problem with that. First, it requires you to pick two fights. Every time you want to pass a bill, you have to go collect votes from other members of the Senate and say, will you vote for my infrastructure bill? Ooh, infrastructure. I like infrastructure. I could get behind an infrastructure bill. What's your pay for? Oh, my pay for is closing some tax loopholes that benefit very wealthy people. They use these loopholes. We're going to close them, and that's how I'm going to get the revenue. Oh, no, I can't vote for that, right? I can't give you my vote, because I'm not going to vote for the tax piece, but I was happy to go along with the infrastructure piece. So guess what? We get no infrastructure. We can't pass an infrastructure bill because we insist on picking two fights. So here's what MMT says. MMT says, first, hang on. How do you know the offsets are necessary? Do you need to pick the second fight, right? So, and I want to make this very, very clear. I'm not saying don't close the tax loopholes. I'm not saying that. I'm saying if you have to choose between getting part of what you want, infrastructure investment, or nothing, it seems to me getting part of what you want is better than nothing, right? If you could get the votes for the infrastructure, but right now you don't have enough votes to raise taxes on the rich or close these loopholes or whatever, then take the partial win, right? If you can do that without creating inflationary pressure. So the first question should always be, could we safely do spending on X, Y, or Z without the offsets? Is it possible, right? Is there enough slack? Is there enough fiscal space in the economy to safely absorb that proposed spending without needing to offset that spending? And if there is, then take the low-hanging fruit. The low-hanging fruit is the fiscal space. You just have to decide how you want to use it. Republicans would use it for tax cuts, and defense spending. Democrats could take the same fiscal space and say, I want to use it for education and infrastructure, or part of a Green New Deal, or whatever the case may be. But the fiscal space is there for the taking, right? It's the low-hanging fruit. So take it. Now, the question about taxes. The fiscal space will close in around you as the economy moves closer to full employment. As the economy moves closer to full employment, there are fewer unemployed people. Factories are operating closer to maximum capacity. There's less slack available. And as the fiscal space closes in around you, well, guess what? You can't continue to write spending bills without offsets, because now the spending carries heightened inflation risk. So the offsets become important. So MMT is about fundamentally transforming the budgeting process so that we don't do the stupid stuff we do today. Well, pay-go, right? Where we think that every dollar of spending always needs to be offset. No, that leads to all kinds of problems where you can't pass good bills because you're afraid to add to the deficit. So you insist on a tax increase that no one will vote for. So you get nothing. So let me just say one more thing. I know that you want to get to more questions, but I bet this is one of them. Here's the inflation thing, right? What do they teach you about inflation and how to understand the inflation dynamics, or what gives rise to inflation? If you're a principal student, first year econ, they probably have something in there about demand pull versus cost push inflation. And maybe they say, inflation pressures can come because, energy prices go up, or, wages, you push wages higher and that leads to higher prices or something. So you get this cost push story. Or you could just have, like Milton Friedman, too much money chasing too few goods. Demand is so hot and producers can't keep up. So there's not enough supply, so prices go up, right? Okay, that broadly speaking, that makes sense. But God, inflation is more nuanced and complex than that, right? Inflation is a dynamic process. It is a continuous rise in the price of a basket of goods that we human beings put together. We create an index and we say what goes in the CPI or the PCE, and then we decide how to weight each of the things inside, how much weight to give food, entertainment, housing, energy, healthcare, transportation. How do we weight that? And then we watch what happens to the prices of all the stuff in the basket over time. And what I'm saying is, you can get headline inflation because the price of just one thing in the basket is going up. Like for us, healthcare, right? Healthcare premiums start skyrocketing, prescription drug prices, and that component of your basket drags up the entire basket. So it looks like inflation. It registers as inflation. My question for you then is, so how do you fight that kind of inflation? Do you want the central bank raising interest rates to fight headline inflation being driven by rising healthcare premiums? So people can't afford their healthcare and the solution is higher interest rates? Like, that makes no sense. But similarly, do you want government to raise taxes to fight that kind of inflation? You can't afford your healthcare, prescription drug premiums are going up, raise taxes to fight inflation. That wouldn't make sense either. So what I'm saying is, no one should have a one-size-fits-all solution to dealing with inflationary pressures. To fight inflation, you have to know where it's coming from. It's like if my basement is flooded and I walk downstairs and I see water, standing water in the basement, I know I have a problem, but I don't know what to do about it, because I don't know if one of my kids left the faucet running, the toilet overflowed, a pipe burst, the dishwasher's leaking. I don't know how to fix the problem because I don't know where the problem is coming from. Inflation is the same way. You shouldn't have an impulse, do this to fight inflation, without knowing what's driving the inflationary pressure, right? You need a toolkit, right? You need many different places that you can operate, right? Levers to pull, different interventions to deal with inflationary pressure, depending upon what's giving rise to the inflationary pressure.
What do you think, sort of a like an easy to comprehend metric could be for policymakers assessing the inflationary consequences of their bills being passed?
So look, I've done this. I co-authored 2 Levy research papers. One was on looking at the federal job guarantee. So what if government implemented a federal job guarantee, offered a job to anyone who was ready, willing, and able to work, but unable to find a job anywhere else in the economy? What if government paid them $15 an hour and benefits, right? We had a wage and benefit package. And at that point, it's a perfectly elastic demand curve for labor. You set the price and you let the quantity float. You hire everybody who comes through the door, right? So we modeled it. We did the macro analysis, and we did it the way I described earlier, which is, the first question is, do we even need to offset the spending? What would happen if we didn't have offsets? So you run the macro analysis, and we used, conventional mainstream macroeconomic forecasting kind of model, the FAIR model, to do the simulations. And what the model told us is that we could hire an average of, we figured about 15 million people on average would be in the program at any point in time. In a downturn, more, in a strong recovery, fewer. On average, 15 million people in the program, making $15 an hour in benefits. We modeled it and we projected 10 years out into the future. What would happen to inflation? Where would interest rates move? What would happen to the deficit and the And what we found is, and I don't have the numbers fresh in my head because it's been a few years since we published it, but you create lots and lots, millions of new private sector jobs because you hire the unemployed, they have an income, they spend, that supports jobs in the rest of the economy, boosts hiring and spending, investment, and so forth. So the bottom line was that you did not push inflation markedly above the Fed's 2% target. So inflation picked up some in the early years, but then it settles back down and falls back down to the Fed's 2% target or whatever it was. And then we did the same thing for student debt cancellation. And we worked actually with Mark Zandi, who's chief economist at Moody's Analytics. And we did runs of our own on the FAIR model, but we also did runs using Moody's, the Zandi model at Moody's. And again, what we were able to do is do the hypothetical. What if government canceled 1.6 trillion in student loan debt, freeing up all that cash flow for people to turn around and spend or save in, whatever they choose, not servicing that student debt? What would happen? Same thing. More job creation, stronger growth, minimal impact on inflation. Is it perfect? No model is going to perfectly forecast the future. But do we have the tools as economists to get a pretty good sense of, this policy, the macro effects of doing that or doing this? What are the inflationary impacts likely? Yeah, we do. We have reasonably good tools to evaluate inflation risk.
And one final question. So if you were just starting your PhD in 2020, what question relating to modern monetary theory would you tackle if you were to start today?
Okay, I'm going to have to say the inflation stuff because, this is where the price action is, so to speak. Just before joining you, I was on I'm not allowed to say exactly what I was doing, but I was on another call, and I can tell you that, inflation, it's always the elephant in the room, right? Everybody always wants to understand inflation, especially people in the finance community. And there is such a divergence of viewpoints. There are big name people out there who are saying that in 3 years' time, we are going to be back in the 1970s with a period that looks like what we experienced with stagflation, depressed economies, high levels of unemployment, and double-digit inflation. Okay, there are people out there talking that book. And then there are people at the other extreme that say we are in a disinflationary, if not deflationary environment, and we've been here for the better part of a couple of decades, and there's no end in sight. And this is what we're doing. Central banks have thrown their hands up in the air. They will openly tell you now. I mean, literally, you're hearing people, former members of the Board of Governors, the Federal Reserve, say openly in speeches, the Federal Reserve has no working model of inflation. That's Daniel Tarullo. You can look it up. So when Tarullo, who served on the Board of Governors, goes out and gives a speech that says, we don't actually have any model that works for how inflation works, right? That's an area that is ripe for more work to be done. I think that's probably what I would do.
So anyone who's starting a PhD in the chat, feel free.
Yeah, and by the way, when we talk about fiscal space and that kind of thing, measuring fiscal space, right, trying to get a handle on fiscal space, because inflation can happen for reasons completely disconnected to how intensively we're putting pressure on our resource capacity, right? So there are economists. I know there was a paper that came out of INET a couple of years ago with 3 Italians co-authoring, and they're doing work to try to get a better model fiscal space. There is a guy, Phil Pilkington, who's a financial analyst there in the UK, He works at GMO as a financial analyst. He's been doing research trying to get a better sense of, how big is the output gap, how much fiscal space is there. So that would be outstanding. The more we can do to provide, more empirical support for this question of where the limits are and fiscal space and that sort of thing, I think that'd be
fantastic. So to wrap things up, if anyone in the chat or is interested in finding out more, I would strongly recommend the Deficit Myth. It's right behind Stephanie in the camera. It's available from all leading bookstores. I would also strongly recommend the blog New Economic Perspectives, of which she is editor-in-chief. And I hope to see everyone soon. Thank you very much, Stephanie.
You're very welcome. Listen, everybody, stay safe and good luck with your studies and then beyond.